Hello, everyone. My name is Mike Sokolow, and I'm the director of the McGillicuddy Humanities Center at the University of Maine. I'm very pleased to welcome you to tonight's event, our Undergraduate Fellows Showcase, titled The Stories We Tell. The first showcase is this evening, and the second one will be tomorrow at 7 p.m. And we're very excited for both because we're just so proud of our program and our fellows. Before we get started with tonight's official introductions, I'd like to do two things. First, I need to make everyone aware that this event is being recorded. It will be uploaded to the center's YouTube page. The second thing I'd like to do is to read the University of Maine's official acknowledgement of the land. The University of Maine recognizes that it is located on Marsh Island in the homeland of the Penobscot Nation, where issues of water and territorial rights and encroachment upon sacred sites are ongoing. Penobscot homeland is connected to the other Wabanaki tribal nations, the Passamaquoddy, the Maliseet, and the Micmac, through kinship and alliances and diplomacy. The university also recognizes that the Penobscot Nation and the other Wabanaki tribal nations are distinct, sovereign, legal, and political entities with their own powers of self-governance and self-determination. Okay, now to introduce the McGillicuddy Humanities Center Humanities Specialist, Karen Sieber, who assembled tonight's program and will be introducing our fellows tonight. Karen Sieber helps oversee the day-to-day operations of the center, which include planning and implementing events, working with faculty and student scholars, and providing outreach and support to humanities institutions and educators statewide. She's focused on promoting the continued relevance of the humanities and supporting interdisciplinary research and programming that engages diverse audiences. As an historian, Karen consults on a variety of public-facing history projects nationwide, from museum exhibits to PBS programs, and she serves as the research and outreach coordinator for the Theodore Roosevelt Center and Digital Library. Her work has been featured or used as a resource by the American Historical Association, Oral History Reviews in Education Project, the History Channel, the Newberry Library, and others. Karen, welcome, and thank you very much for producing tonight's program, and I'm looking forward to you introducing our fellows.
Well, thank you very much for everyone joining. As Michael said, my name is Karen Sieber. Tonight is the first in a two-night showcase. And so tonight, Katherine and Nola will be presenting. Tomorrow night, the other two members of their cohort, Nolan Altvater and Haley Seedor. Each presenter will be speaking for roughly 30 minutes back to back, followed by a 30-minute Q&A at the very end that will incorporate both speakers. So if you are unfamiliar with the fellowship program, our fellows receive $4,000 a semester for 2 consecutive semesters to work on the research or creative projects of their choosing. So they have to put together proposals ahead of time. And so the students that you'll hear across this showcase are students that we've been working with for the past year. Even though they all come from very different disciplines, there was alignment this year in the fact that each of them is, in a way, looking at the stories that we tell ourselves from generation to generation and how that can have an impact on the present, on the future, and how changes to the stories that we tell each other can really have an even more inclusive impact on the way that we communicate with each other and understand each other. So I'm incredibly proud of this cohort, especially. They have existed entirely during COVID times. So this has interrupted Katherine's research in Ireland, for instance, or Nolan's ability to hold a public reading, Nola's ability to hold a public reading. So they really had to pivot from their original plans and did so without skipping a beat. So we are just so proud tonight to be able to showcase some of the work that they've been digging into. Keep in mind, they have these greater projects they've been working on for a year. There is no possible way to fit that into a 30-minute presentation. And so consider tonight to kind of be the highlights, some favorite pieces, some takeaways, a little bit of reflection on their experience. Katherine will be up first. She's presenting on What It Was and What I Know, Attempts at Family History. Her creative work examines family histories and storytelling through the lens of her own Irish American heritage through her family. So she was inspired to do this work, especially after a trip abroad to her family's native Ireland. So she is kind of combining oral histories and family lore, but also conflicting historic documents that sometimes don't quite match up with like anyone's family history, don't quite match up to the stories that we tell ourselves. So she is going to be digging into that and examine how important is the truth? Is there still value in these stories that we tell each other? After Katherine will be senior English major and WGS minor Nola Prevost, who will be reading selections from her work, All the Girls in the Woods, Feminist Fairy Tales for the Modern World. So she also is kind of looking at the ability of the fairy tale to create and disseminate and even change societal values. And so she used this form to kind of use it as a means of providing more inclusive voices within fairy tales. And so she's very interested in diverse representation. And so you'll hear likely some stories of not just women, but people of color, the LGBTQ plus community. And so with that, Katherine is going to start us off. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you for that great introduction, Karen. I don't know if I could have said it better myself about my project. So as Karen said, I looked at family history. I specifically drilled down on my paternal grandfather's family history. He was from Ireland, which is where I studied, as Karen said. And I guess I'll go ahead. This first piece is actually the first piece in my entire thesis. It's one of a lot of lyric essays. I don't know if I have a running count, but it's up there. And yeah, I'll go ahead. The largest debate is about where they are born. In 1922, the IRA burns all civil records held in Dublin. Among those are any proof of where George and Mary are born and confirmation of which county or which town they lived in. There are 3 different boats that Mary comes over on. In one of them, she has a friend. In the others, she is alone. In all of them, she leaves from Cork. George appears on one singular manifest, coming from Liverpool. How he gets from Cork to Liverpool is never explained. It never needs to be. The tricky part is when they get to Boston. A 1930 census record lists them all living in Charlestown, lists George and Mary as being born in Ireland. It lists the names and ages of all of their children, confirming their birth order and the existence of all 4 of them. We never see a single birth certificate, nothing that proves dates of birth, nothing that tells me if they are born in Boston or somewhere else. Once, I was told that George and Mary took their family back to Ireland as often as they could. My grandfather is even born there. In one story, they are all born there, and they don't arrive in Boston until my grandfather is 8 years old. A marriage license lists George and Mary as being born in America. I just don't buy it. I think that they didn't have their own birth certificates, so they found others. My grandfather's draft card lists his height and eye color, lists his mother as his emergency contact. It includes a series of numbers that have to mean something, but I don't know what they mean. They might signify where he enlists, where he is going for boot camp. It might list a number that only matters within military records, but I wouldn't know. George, his brother, has a card that says the exact same thing. They both list their mother as next of kin, not their father. It makes sense. I list my mother as my first emergency contact, and my father as my second on every form where it asks for them. I think it is just a thing that we do. There are obituaries featured in an archive of the Boston Globe, but I've never gone ahead and spent the necessary $5 to view them. Sometimes Charlie's obituary stares at me and waits for me to click on it, waiting for me to prove a good story wrong. My grandfather's exists in that same database, a single click away from me confirming his daughter's name. His funeral card sits in a box in my basement somewhere, 15 copies of them stacked together, in the same condition they were in 30 years ago. His death certificate, the only one of these that we know and did not discover, is neatly folded in 3. It hides itself in an unmarked envelope at the bottom of a box in my basement. On it, it lists that both of his parents had been born in Ireland. It is the only document that I know to be true. So these next 3 also come from the first third of my thesis, and they actually all come right after each other. I look at my grandfather and then each of his brothers. In 1943, Michael John Reardon, or John Michael Reardon, depending on who you ask, enlists in the Air Force. There is a war going on, after all. George, his brother, has already done this, and it doesn't seem like the worst idea. There doesn't seem to be a lot of options for kids like him, and this is something. What is a kid like him? Kids that leave high school, kids that aren't qualified for a lot, kids that leave high school to work to help their father support their family, kids that will do that by any means necessary, whatever that means. George goes Navy, maybe because he likes boats, and maybe because the Navy recruiter was the first one he saw. Michael, however, finds the Air Force recruiter. He also might have just liked planes. He ends up in bombardier training. No, he doesn't. He's 6 feet tall, and we read somewhere that bombardiers are small, 5'3" or something like that. He flies the planes. No, he doesn't. It feels wrong. He trains dogs. I don't know why the Air Force needs dogs, but he trains them. Maybe he doesn't actually train them, but he at least goes to a few days of training. He gets the gist of it. He trains his own dogs in the exact same way that the Air Force did, and his son does it too. He takes something from his time in the Air Force. He isn't like George, though. He doesn't last. Barely lasts the war, if at all, leaves with what is likely a dishonorable discharge. He drives trucks and stays almost associated with the local Teamsters Union, but not officially. It doesn't call to him like it calls to George, I think. They're different, like brothers often are. All right. George, the second, my great uncle, had red hair. My dad told me that everyone called him Red because we are obviously very imaginative when it comes to nicknames. My dad said that he was the nicest guy in the world. He is one of the only people in his father's family that he has ever really referred to. He was career Navy. He joined in World War II and just never seemed to leave it. I like to think that I understand that based on the stories. My father has claimed that his father never graduated high school. He went to work instead. I wouldn't be surprised to learn the same thing about George, to learn that the war came and he saw an opportunity to change the trajectory of his life. I think that he was the kind of man that craved that form of structure, the discipline, that it was all a perfect storm to knock him into the kind of life that he needed. My dad has never said a bad thing about his Uncle George. He had 3 sons, George, Bobby, and Charlie. I've been coming back to names a lot. It's hard not to, considering the people in my family. 3 Georges in a row, paired off with 3 Michael Johns. I think he names his son Charlie because his brother is barely 25 when he dies. I don't know where Bobby comes from, and just maybe it doesn't come from anywhere. I keep forgetting it, but it is in fact entirely possible that some of the people in my family were named for no other reason than that it was a nice name. George moved to Florida at some point. I'm not sure about the year, but I think his children were grown by then. He died about 5 years after my grandfather, 15 years after his sister, and almost 50 years after Charlie. My dad's Uncle George, the second one, had red hair. He was the nicest guy in the world. I know that to be true. Okay, and this is the last in this little quartet from the beginning. My grandfather had 2 brothers and a sister, George, Charles, and Mary, respectively. I never met them. George was career Navy or Air Force. I think it was the Navy. I think he had sons too. I've never heard much about Mary, but I wonder about the name. She was probably named after her mother. The one that I keep thinking about is Charles. I've only ever heard someone refer to him as Charlie, never as Charles. He was the youngest. When I was little, and when my dad was younger too, we all heard the same story. Charlie, like the rest of his brothers, fought in World War II. Charlie was Navy and stationed at Pearl Harbor. He died in the attack, and that's what made his older brothers enlist in the war. I have a few theories about Charlie, a few stories that might tell me what happened. In one story, Charlie is woken up to the first wave of the attack, to the first bombings. Like many others, he is left utterly unprepared, but somehow he pulls it together. He has been in the Nevada for a few weeks, months at the very most, but some small part of him is prepared. It is one of the gasoline fires that kills him. The Nevada takes 6 bombs that morning, with 1 exploding near the gasoline tank. The intense fires that followed would be what finally killed him. In a different version, he is stationed on the Arizona. He doesn't have a chance. Later, I would find out that about half of the lives lost that day were on the USS Arizona, and I would place Charlie among them. It would be the explosion that killed him, or maybe it was something else. No one would ever fully know what happened on the Arizona that day, but I would place Charlie on it. The thing is, I hope to God that none of these theories are true, because I have seen my great uncle Charlie's birth certificate. He was 14 years old when Pearl Harbor was attacked. I know that it doesn't rule anything out, but can that be false? Can it just be that a story got misconstrued? Can it be that he actually died in Korea and my grandfather looked at his little brother and gave him a war that the US won? Can it be that over 60 years we got something wrong and that a 14-year-old boy didn't die a million miles away from home? In my own defense, the story doesn't add up. I haven't met a single 14-year-old that did not look like they were exactly 14 years old. I don't think the Navy would have been fooled. I don't think they would have let a 14-year-old enlist before we were even fighting in a war. I think a story just got a little better over the years and a little more heartbreaking. I have other theories, other stories that explains it away just a little bit better. In a different story, one that is much more true, Charlie never goes to Hawaii. He thinks about it though. He wants the sunlight, he doesn't like the snow, but he likes being near the ocean. He always tells his brothers and his sister that when he is old enough, he will go to Hawaii. In a different story, one that I know to be true, Charlie is barely 14 when the Arizona sinks. He does not sink with it. Years later, he might remember that Charlie said something about Hawaii once, and he will create a different story. In death, his little brother gets to go to Hawaii. In death, he gives his younger brother a better story. But here's the thing. I want the story to be false. So this next one's from the second part of my thesis, where I write mostly about my time studying abroad in Ireland. It kind of exists as an interlude between the beginning and the end of the family story. So yeah. I let my dad pick out hotels for me. Part of it is because he's worked in the hotel business and he knows what he's talking about. The other part is that he wants me to be safe, and that's something I can live with. He took special care to make sure that his children live in a safe town, and he spent weeks looking into the colleges that I was planning on attending. It doesn't bother me too much that this concerns him. So I let him pick out hotels for me. I lived in Ireland for a few months, and while I was there, I took a vacation by myself. It just worked out that I had 5 days off of classes to catch up on reading, and I happened to be ahead on my reading. So I started looking at train tickets and cities I wanted to go to and how much money I had in my savings account. I picked Galway City. I asked my dad if it was okay for me to do that, as if I wasn't a 20-year-old woman that had the right to do whatever I pleased, because that is what I do. I asked my dad if it's all right for me to take a trip alone, and he picks out my hotel for me. It always tends to be just a bit more money than I want to spend, but I do it anyways. I spent 3 nights in Galway and changed trains twice each way. On the way up, a woman my mother's age helped me with the station and kept an eye on me as I read amongst women with my headphones in. I ate at the bar every night because eating dinner at a table alone has always felt like a particular kind of torture for me. On the second night, I spent hours talking to the bartender, a girl maybe 3 years older than me, and she wrote the name of 5 bars where she knew the bartenders on the back of an old receipt. "My boys will take care of you," were her exact words, and I gave her a €6 tip, even though you don't tip in Europe. 2 of her friends bought me drinks, and I had a very intense conversation with one of them about the lack of decent tequila in Ireland. I stayed until midnight every night and walked maybe 2 minutes to get back to my hotel because my dad picked the hotel that was the closest to all of the bars that I might want to go to. He is good at it, picking out hotels for me. These last 2 both come from the final third of my thesis, and this one I'm going to read is actually the second to last lyric essay of my entire thesis. Michael John Reardon only gives his son one requirement when it comes to where he goes to college. Despite sending him to Catholic school for his entire life, he probably doesn't think that someone in his family can do things like that. He's never imagined anyone going to a college that isn't Boston State. Today, that is UMass Boston. The only thing he tells his son is that he has no money to pay for it. It probably isn't one of those things that ever had to be said. Maybe that is almost his way of telling his son that he was proud of him, that he was proud that he might even go to college. It might even be faith in his son, faith in his football skills that have gotten me this far, faith that they will get him into college. It could be one of those things that Irish fathers sometimes do, where they never actually go ahead and tell you that they're proud of you. They just say little things like that. I don't know. All of them make sense to me. Whatever it was, his son listens. His mother, before she had died, had said that she wanted him to go to a Catholic college. He listens. He only talks to the recruiters from Catholic colleges, always tell the recruiters that he needs a scholarship. The only legitimate offers come from Notre Dame, Fordham University, and Boston College. Fordham cuts their football program. Notre Dame doesn't offer any money. Boston College offers a full scholarship, and he walks to the school every time that he visits. His father could visit him every single day if he wanted to, but he doesn't. His son visits him instead. I don't know if he ever went to Boston College's campus, if he saw his son graduate from college or from his graduate degree. I just know that 15 years after he graduated, his son started baptizing his children there. This last one is the opener to the last third of my thesis. It's probably one of the first things I wrote of this entire thing, and also probably one of the shortest. Here's how I see the whole thing. The world isn't kind to you. Not really. I understand that happens, especially to new immigrants, oftentimes to Irish immigrants. The stories aren't that good. There's never a hero. You are all just ordinary people who might disappear among another immigrant story. The world isn't kind to you, but you're not special in that regard. Maybe there's a few standout events, a few stories are almost glorious, but aren't really. It doesn't matter, because you can tell a good story. So the stories get better. Somewhere they are in fact grounded in truth. But it doesn't matter. They aren't true anymore. And to be honest, it doesn't bother me too much. Are we all storytellers? Thank you. I guess without further ado, I'll turn it over to Nola.
And I'll mention quickly, if you do have questions for either one of the speakers, feel free to put them in the chat, and I'll moderate a Q&A at the very end after both of the speakers. But wonderful job, Katherine. Thank you so much. Excited to discuss it further with you. Nola, we'd love to hear All the Girls in the Woods, some selections from that.
All right, that was awesome. I'm so glad that I got to hear that. All right, let me get set up. I'll actually be sharing my screen. So just give me a hot minute. So, All the Girls in the Woods. In the end, we are all lost in the woods, shoulder to shoulder with foreign fauna, holding staring contests with the flora. We are walking nowhere. Girls, we poke our heads out of squirrel holes, carry seeds from ground to tree, branch in our beaks, we stalk the path, tails wagging, claws clicking on the stones, and we bring cakes to our grandmother's cottages. Girls wiggle in between the moss tendrils. We call the fairies when it's time for greenery. We raise the pansies from their undead rest. We drip from the moistened early morning maple leaves. The dryads know something you don't. Does that scare you? If we don't want to be plucked from the depths of the forest, what else can you call yourself? So that was a poem called All the Girls in the Woods from the aptly titled collection of the same title. My project this whole year has been a mixture of creative writing and history and research and literary analysis, diving into the question of how does queerness and feminism intersect with fairy tales and that genre. So I'm going to be reading a lot of selections from my work, but not before I talk a little bit about the history and the genre conventions and what makes them queer, just to situate my work in the greater, scholarly discipline. All right, so what are fairy tales? it seems pretty obvious, and we all probably have a basic innate sense of what those are. And it's likely that none of this will sound necessarily new to you. However, it was important for me to figure out what exactly are fairy tales in the first place and what makes them up in order to write them, which we'll get into the whole collection in a minute, like I said. So I had to nail down some basic criteria for myself to work in, and that's otherwise known as genre conventions. So the first basic idea is that fairy tales are pretty ageless and timeless. They exist in this sort of no man's land of space. We get a sense that the time frame or historical period isn't the important thing about the story. It's the characters and the theme and the plot that's most important. This isn't always the case, but it's part of the way the mood is set. This helps the story feel universal and accessible to many people. So the next part is that there's some sort of allegorical or symbolic trait to it. This heavily relates to the theme and the messaging. And often we get these sort of symbolic elements because they're meant to model a certain type of behavior or status quo. They're sometimes created as modeling tools for social scripts that authors want to support. That was something I was particularly interested in with this project, and something that I tried to think about as I was writing these creative pieces. Finally, fairy tales have some sort of magical or surreal element to them. This is really fun to play with. And this is something that feels pretty common for us to think about when we think about movies like, Disney movies or whatever. So whether it's a talking animal or a candelabra that sings and dances, magical objects and settings are a staple of the fairy tale genre. One literary critic, Katherine Reardon, who wrote Thinking Through Things, which was about queering fairy tales, he said, "The wonder evoked by magical things, the spell cast by the vital, lively objects that talk and move and exercise a subjectivity rivaling that of their human users, these are important elements in establishing the marvelous setting of the fairy tale. The appearance of objects with supernatural powers is a sign to the reader that they are entering a realm where the rules of everyday life do not apply." These genre conventions are so unique, but they're not mutually exclusive to fairy tales. So we might even, be able to consider these, in relation to things like ancient mythos or local legends or other folk tales as being connected to and part of the genre. All right, so I'm going to try to give you a brief history of fairy tales, though they've literally existed for basically however long humans have been here. So real quick, fairy tales have evolved out of folk tales. They're very similar to each other, but I think the thing that seems the defining factor for fairy tales is that they include that sort of magical element, and often they are considered children's stories, but that wasn't always true. For a long time, fairy tales and folk tales were told, for all ages and across all class systems and genders and family units and communities. They were a set of oral stories that helped define a group or a community's or a culture's identity. And that was something that was really important for me to think about too. And something that is really key to mention here is that our modern idea of what fairy tales are comes from the Enlightenment period, when the upper class bourgeoisie started to get a hold of fairy tales. They kind of realized that the allegorical and symbolic elements of it, they can use this to further their own agendas, essentially, and bolster their own political claims. So being in the influential class that they were, they started publishing a lot of fairy tales that they either wrote or approved of with heavy revisions, and took advantage of the manufactured authenticity of the genre. So many of the fairy tales that we see through that time and afterwards were often published by influential white upper class men, such as Charles Perrault, who wrote Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty, and the Brothers Grimms, who basically wrote everything else. And so we see from here that these ideas, mainly about women, especially, we start to see them being modeled after expectations for the upper class. Having them be polite and graceful and petite and beautiful and all that boring stuff. So this is where we start seeing the feminist issues arise, and the socio-political topics start to really infiltrate and be used specifically and directly. And so some women authors actually took advantage of the fairy tale and started using it as a way to combat these ideas that were being infiltrating into the genre. I won't get into all of them together, but I just wanted to point these out in case anyone was interested. So these are some really awesome early feminist writers, and I had a lot of fun reading from them. And I'm also happy to pass along any citations or bibliography, because everything was really fun to read. All right, so the queer and feminist potential of fairy tales, which is really important just because it's the main focus and point of my project, and it defines the contemporary relevance of my project. So I want to just briefly talk about, what is queer, what does queer mean, and what does it mean for fairy tales? So my working definition, comes from personal experience, but also, in terms of this genre, comes from one specific text from Louis Seifert, which is called Marbles and Tales. And it basically says that queer designates those genders and sexualities that resist those normative constructions, including not only gay, male, and lesbian sexualities, but also non-normative heterosexualities in the range of gender expression. So this is where we get the idea, we start to get this framework that is resisting against binary thinking, and it starts to situate things in more of a spectrum rather than placing things in different boxes and labels. And that's kind of the whole idea about the word queer and not only the identity itself, but how the word is used in feminist theory and gender theory. So obviously we see this ambiguity as a really great leap into fairy tales and how we approach fairy tales, because it exaggerates and extends the already queer elements of the fairy tale genre. So we see that it translates really well into these allegorical and magical elements that I was referring to. So what I ended up creating for my whole project, which is the huge focus, which was a collection called All the Girls in the Woods. And it features 17 different creative pieces, mix of prose and poetry and fiction, partly because I love writing in those, but also because having that mix, having that hybrid really was helpful for me in terms of reflecting that queer element of fairy tales. So we have a lot of variety going on here. Plus, I also wrote a literary introduction to the piece, which helped me prepare for the presentation and also extends a lot of the information that I've given so far. And of course, my goal was to blend feminism, queerness, and fairy tales and that genre, and see sort of what I could do with it, and see how I can make it relevant to today's world. I also wanted to mention that I think the allegorical part was pretty key for me. It was the part that I was particularly excited about, and it helped me sort of lean into these queer elements, like I said earlier, and it helped me also share meaning and meaning making to a wide range of people, while catering to those groups of people who have been systematically marginalized, oppressed, disenfranchised, and forgotten. While my stories can be appreciated by a lot of different people, it's those that have been neglected and abused by society who I want to amplify the stories of. And that specifically came into the form of women, the LGBT community, and the people of color. And so some of the stories that I've shared today, that I'm going to share today, excuse me, are going to touch on some of those subjects. And so one of the first pieces that I really wanted to talk about was a piece called Patchwork Woman. I'm just gonna, I talk really fast and so a lot, so. All right, so this piece, I wanted to just give a little bit of background when I go into this. I'm going to be reading off of the screen. The text is going to be there, and partly I have it there because it's going. The video is going to be on YouTube, and I want this to live in both an audio and a text form. You know, before I go into trying to get this published eventually. This is sort of where it's going to live. So I liked the idea of having text on there. Plus it helps with accessibility for people that just might want it or need it. And you don't have to read it. It's there for, you know, mostly my own reference, but if you want to, that's fine, but you can also just sit back and relax. So Patchwork Woman is one of my favorite pieces from the whole collection. I'm very excited to share it. The premise is that women in this society have stitched seams all across their joints. They're, you know, across their hands and their fingers and their toes and their elbows and all that. And it's very similar to the story of the woman that has a ribbon around her neck, if you've read Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark. So our narrator, who remains nameless, has pink seams. You know, everyone has different colors. And this story follows her and her relationship with her body and how it changes when she meets a boy in college. So at the point in the story where I'm going to be starting to read, they've gone on a couple dates. She's met his parents and they've had a bit of fun together. So we're going to see where that fun leads and what that means for our main character. Right. I had a dream that I was at the cinema watching a movie about a woman who, while cooking dinner for her husband, found a toe in the stew. She wasn't sure what to make of it, so she scooped it out and buried it in the backyard. Excuse me, hang on a second. As she was setting the table, the phone rang, and on the other end was heavy, labored breathing, slow, methodical, heavy breathing. She hung up. The audience in the theater groaned. A few moments later, the door creaks open, and she thinks it's her husband home from work. But then she hears an unfamiliar voice, hissing and gurgling like a snake underwater. Who stole my toe? The woman ran upstairs as the stranger stomped through the house. She cowered behind the bathroom door, holding her breath. Several moviegoers exclaimed that she was done for. Suddenly, the stranger appeared at the window. It was the corpse of her unborn child, drenched and covered in seaweed and barnacles. The small zombie eyed the woman unblinkingly as she screamed and cried for forgiveness, and the woman was never seen again. The next week, my period was late. Hang on a second. The thing is blocking my site. There we go. All right. Next week, my period was late. I sat there in the bathroom trying to make it come out, prodding my belly with my fingers. I carried an extra tampon in my purse as a good luck charm. When I saw him that evening, he said I was probably just stressed. I needed to give myself a break from studying and work and just relax. The next morning, I drove to the convenience store and got a test, 2 lines. I bought another one just in case, 2 lines. The third time I walked in, the clerk told me to stop kidding myself. Our wedding was in the community garden. We spent a good chunk of our savings on decorations and catering, but the garden itself was just a small deposit to the city in case we broke their fountain. Our families were pleased, at least. I found a dress with a skirt that fit just over my belly, so the bump wasn't too obvious. Once my husband graduated and started his career at the biolab, we could afford to buy a house in town. As I swelled up like a water balloon, I found it increasingly difficult to believe I wouldn't completely disassemble in the delivery room, right there on the table. Worst of all, I prayed for my baby that it wouldn't be a girl. Every night, my nightmares consisted of the doctor pulling out a tiny arm or a tiny leg, unthreaded by the pressure coming into this world in pieces like a furniture set. They lock people away for having dreams like that, my husband told me. I can't stop them. They happen every night. You worry too much. One morning, he was getting ready for work in the bedroom, and I was settling onto the couch, putting my feet up on the coffee table. That's when I realized there was a peculiar blank spot between my first and third toe, on both feet, in fact. The pink thread was still dangling there, like it had been torn out. I screamed. He ran in and stared at where I was pointing. My toes are gone. You're what? His voice sounded so nonchalant, as if talking to a child. My toes are gone, I stammered and pointed at the hole in my foot. He peered down at it. Hun, you need to calm down. I had the urge to snap his vocal cords. My toes are fucking missing. How can you be calm? I had half a mind to smack him when a thought crossed my mind. Did you take them? I said calmly. His brow furrowed. What? No. Where are they? Honey, I don't know what you're talking about. They're right there on your foot. My eyes burned a hole into his face. How could I have taken them if they're still right there? I looked back again at the very empty space between my other toes, but he stared at me as if I had turned inside out. He saw them there. How could they still be there if I can't see them? All this stress is not good for the baby, he uttered, putting a hand on my belly. You need to get it together, okay? For her. I straightened up. Her? He grinned slowly. The doctor called this morning. For some reason, the way he said that little pronoun made it feel so okay, that her being a girl wouldn't mean the end of the world. He sounded so sure and gleeful, the corners of his mouth pinned to his ears. I couldn't help but smile too. Don't cry, baby, he cooed. I hadn't even felt the tears welling up. We embraced for a long while, hugging around the daughter growing inside me. He brought me to the bed and took off his watch. It had been months since he touched me in those special places. Patiently, he spread his hands all over me like every gesture was strategic. He led me to the edge of nowhere and watched me hungrily as I left off. When he left for the lab, I checked my foot once more, wrapped in the sheets. The toes were still missing. There was no unseeing that mirage. I spent the afternoon tearing through the house looking for them. After searching around in the sheets and the bath drain and in my shoes and socks, neither toe reappeared. I kept hoping they would somehow return if I wished hard enough. If I conjured them up in my mind, everything would be normal. Still, nothing changed. I shoved my lame feet into my shoes and went for a walk, trying to forget. Hiding them in there helped, but the inside of the shoes felt a little too spacious. I felt like a dog when its owner shoves shoes on its feet for the first time. But maybe it was just that, a mirage. Though, then again, my toes couldn't feel their sisters beside them, nor could the hidden nerves feel the inside of my sneaker. Was I really going mad? What was this baby doing to me? My mind wasn't entirely in my own pocket. One night, I dreamt I was swimming in a nondescript ocean, searching in underwater caverns to find my husband. Every time I poked my head above water, I called his name into the dark, lonely caves. I kept hearing something gargled in the slippery echoes, and I was almost sure my husband was around another turn. My arms were exhausted from pushing against the current. The water got blacker the deeper I went. In the third or fourth cavern, peeking at me between the stalagmites, something like a chipmunk stared at me with its wide brown eyes. Gripping onto the wall, I asked if it had seen my husband. It started screaming, so loudly, in fact, that the stalactites dripped, elongated, picking up speed until it started raining. I crashed beneath the water and watched as all of my efforts pounded against the surface. Our small girl is thrust into this world through pain and glory, a grand entrance befitting 12 hours of labor. The doctor was more sterilizer than man, his oversized hands passing me my child like she was a choice cut of meat. I counted all of her fingers and toes, no extras, no missing. She was so small and soft in my arms. She was lighter than air. Hi, my sweet pea. So glad to finally meet you. She stared at me with wide, beautiful brown eyes. Around all of her joints, like mine, were her own stitches. Orange thread wrapped each of her elbows and fingers and knees, even her cute little ears. Everything was where it should be. My husband crouched down beside us and watched her sleep on me. She was such a quiet infant. He studied her with great interest and said, "She has them too." I wasn't sure how to respond to that. It was hard to tell if he was disappointed or just noticing, like talking about the weather. "She looks like a porcelain doll." He didn't reply. So that was an excerpt from what I have so far. And I had a lot of fun writing this story. I liked thinking about the twists and the turns. And I hope that eventually, once it's published, you'll all be able to read what happens afterwards. So the next piece that I wanted to share is called Differentials. It's just a short poem, but I had a lot of fun playing with it. And I absolutely love the language in it. It was one of the only ones that had a more modern feel to it, just because of the subject matter, which you'll see soon. And it gave me another opportunity to queer this already really queer and feminist genre. So, Differentials. It is so easy to fall asleep under a car. The sky can't see you weeping. I find solace just below the exhaust, hushes me to a silence unknown. The sandpaper pavement leaves reminders in my cheeks. The white neighborhood and 2.5-inch lawns barely notice, but the owner of the Toyota RAV4 is late for work. Why can't you curl up in someone else's driveway? I count the rust spots on the axles, itch them free from the underbelly one by one. I'm enamored with wasting time. It's an acquired taste. I like the way it sticks to the roof of my mouth. There was once a girl so hungry she gobbled up time itself. Her cheeks rotund with those savory minutes. I imagine having to sit inside a woman's mouth until she finished. Imagine if for one moment you did not run the world, like fingers through your greased hair. Imagine having to wait. The guy gives up and walks to the bus stop. I nap in peace. I had a lot of fun with that one. This last piece is called How I End. It's an excerpt from this piece. And the part I'm going to read is at the very end of the story, where our protagonist, again, nameless, is a girl who has been trapped in a manor by an older man who's trying to marry her. On the morning of their wedding, she decides she's going to pull on the front door and just see if it opens. The whole story takes place in the entryway of this house, where she stands and pulls on the handle for hours. At this point in the story, the prospective groom and the servants and staff have gotten sick of her shenanigans and tried to pull her away from the door, resulting in this final scene. To save my shoulder from popping out of its socket, I took the handle in both of my hands and interlocked my fingers. I listened to the clock and strained for the ocean, the summer breeze, my family, my town. I listened for the rocking of the dock in the harbor and the music and new ideas from the trade ships. I heard them once. I had tasted the snow and the rain like it was a gift from God once. I had smelled my mother's cookies once and saw the world in her eyes. I kissed a girl under the maple tree behind the church once, and it was so new it was scary. It gave every part of my body a new name. I saw my dad in my grandfather's jawline, and my grandfather in me, and once I learned everyone I'd ever met carries everyone else with them in their back pocket. I looked for the essence of all that beautiful world to keep my mind on that doorknob, to keep it alive. There was a bang, like gunfire, only we all shot backwards toward the stairs. Amidst the pile of dresses and legs and shoes, with and without feet, I regained my bearings to find that I was still holding onto the doorknob. However, it had become dislodged from the door. I was a little disheartened to have betrayed my post in this way, but as I looked up, I beheld the front walkway, not through any glass barrier, but open air. The breeze drifted in lazily. The horses in the pasture across the road grazed behind the wooden fence. Summer rolled up its sleeves and tipped its hat to me and whispered in the rustle of the trees, "What are you waiting for?" I stood once more, and while the mess of people struggled to get to their feet, I took off down the path and banked hard down the dirt road. I ran without looking back, without needing to. I ran and made sails for my hair. I ran and the world smiled at me. Welcome home. So that was my reading of All the Girls in the Woods and my subsequent presentation. I really hope that you all enjoyed it. I had a lot of fun presenting it. And yeah, that's all I have for you.
Wonderful. Well, it looks like we have a couple of questions coming into the chat. I encourage others to drop your questions in there. It looks like one of our board members, Tim Garrity from Mount Desert Island, has a question for Katherine. Did you detect any differences between the stories that Irish Americans tell versus people telling stories within Ireland itself? Do you think there's a difference in how those stories get translated?
That's a really good question. I saw that pop in and I've been thinking about it for a few minutes now. There weren't any huge, like, big differences that I've noticed from living in Ireland. How people told me stories was really reminiscent of how my own Irish American family would tell me stories. We all have the gift of the gab after all. We're pretty good with using it. Yeah, I found them kind of like hauntingly similar almost. It was really interesting.
And do you think there's any connection to like Irish mythology and folklore and storytelling and song? And, you know, I mean, I just think of storytelling to be such an important thing within Irish culture. Not that it isn't within every culture, but kind of tall tales definitely seem to be a part of a lot of Irish storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. In the Irish literature classes I took while I was over there, I noticed that people were always Irish writers were always very aware of what happened in Ireland before they started writing. And it was always hugely important about what they were writing about. They would write about Celts and Vikings and old wars that nobody remembered anymore. And it was always really important in their writing. And I've definitely seen that reflected with Irish Americans telling stories about things that happened in Ireland, not to them, but it still mattered. And it's still kind of something they carry.
Wonderful. Thank you for that. I have a question for Nola that came in here as well. Did you feel constrained or compelled by the conversations of the genre you were working with?
Yeah, thank you for asking. I at first I felt I suppose a little bit like I don't know, like, how am I supposed to write all this? You know, like about a year ago. And I feel like as it progressed and as I learned more, I felt mostly like I had a sense of guidance rather than I felt constrained. So I suppose I felt more compelled, I think, towards especially towards the end. In the very beginning, I was really interested in just writing allegories in general. Like that was part of the thing that drew me to this topic in particular. So when I had the opportunity to expand upon allegories and write more of them, I got even more excited. And I felt like, a lot of my previous work helped inspire more work that I wrote going forward. So yeah, I guess I think the thing that was, the weirdest constraint, I suppose, was that I guess sort of the magical element, I suppose. I have a weird relationship with fantasy elements, so that was something I just had to think more about. But other than that, I think I just felt mostly compelled. I felt really excited about it.
Wonderful. Always a good feeling to have in your research. One of our former fellows, who is also graduating but finished up her fellowship last semester, Ivy Flesson, has a question for Katherine. Your project clearly takes on one of the most important notions present in our world, the danger of objective truth. Truth or reason, properly conceived, is dangerous because it threatens or challenges what we hold most dear. In this case, the notion of who we are and where we came from. Since we intimately rely on these notions as a source of strength and to feel connected to something larger than ourselves, the deprivation of them could be thought of to be devastating. One might also say that discovering historical records validates or strengthens those notions, or that the process of discovery is interesting and pleasurable in itself. I think this is something that came across in a lot of the fellows' research. And so, yeah, I mean, how important is this idea of truthhood or falsehood? Is there still a value? Do you, with this tension between the two, you mentioned in your readings, as Ivy mentioned, that, you wish that a certain story was true or a certain story is false. How did you go about playing with this tension?
Yeah, that's a really great question. I guess what I always wanted to look at was whether or not it did matter if the stories were true, and I didn't want to do a crazy amount of research to figure it out. I kind of wanted to go at it in a very casual way that anyone could do. So I was looking at it as kind of the everyman. And I found out pretty early on that maybe the objective truth wasn't what I wanted. I didn't want to know exactly what happened. I wanted confirmation that what I thought happened was what happened, which were entirely different things. But I guess I'm still thinking this question out in my head. But I guess the objective truth isn't exactly what I wanted in it.
And do you think that's just particular to this research? So Ivy had asked, would people be better or worse off if they knew the full objective truth of their family histories? I think this is something, your research, similar to mine, is based a lot in historic documents, in facts, in data, in dates, times, people's names. So with technology and having access to all of these digitized documents that were not available just a short time before, or people now doing DNA tests and discovering these whole new sides of their stories that were, kept from them. Do you think we're kind of at a new moment in thinking about our family histories and thinking about where we come from? Do you think that technology is helping us, or is ignorance bliss?
Kind of a little bit of both. I do think that there's value in knowing the truth for some people, but for other people, I think that it's not terrible to still live in the lie or something like this, with family stories. If you want a story to still be true, like, that's fine, go for it. But I think it's kind of a case to case, just like, it's kind of case to case basis on whether or not it's a good thing or a bad thing, I think.
Well, yeah, there's a variety of reasons why people don't pass on the truth. It might be out of trauma. It might be out of just the fact that it wasn't a very interesting story to begin with, or that they wished that some other version of that person was true. So that's very interesting. Michael, our director, has a question. He noticed that both of the projects played with conventions and forms before kind of moving on creatively to kind of play with those forms a little bit. Can both of you reflect on the process of learning these different forms and formats and playing with them, growing confident to kind of make it your own and bend them? I know what you ended up with is not necessarily what you started with. You both did quite a lot of editing, and I'm sure you had other pieces that you kind of worked on that maybe didn't quite fit into the collection as a whole. How did you kind of decide which formats and forms were working with you, or how you wanted to become better at those forms? A lot of this is a learning experience.
Yeah. So before this project, I actually hadn't done much creative writing at all in college. So the first step for this was to figure out how to do creative writing and look at creative nonfiction as a genre. And in doing that, I was able to learn a lot about the normal creative nonfiction essay style, which I then completely ignored in my own pieces. I kind of just started writing it as it made sense to me as I was working through it. So I don't really have like paragraphs. I'll have just like one sentence and then I'll skip 3 lines and then another sentence. And that just kind of made sense as I was thinking about it. And it was literally how I thought about it, how I was talking about it that I wanted to go at it with.
Wonderful. How about you, Nola?
Yeah. So I'm a creative writing student. I should have probably said earlier that I'm an English major, and I'm focusing in creative writing. And this is my senior year. So I've done a lot of creative writing, and I've learned so much over my college experience. So like approaching how to write a story wasn't necessarily like new for me. But I think like thinking about the genre of fairy tales, I suppose, was new in that there were like, maybe this relates back to the constraint question too, that like I wasn't sure exactly. A lot of times I would write something and be really passionate about it, and then I'd be like, does this even fit into my project? Like there was a story that I wrote that was based on a real story, and so it wasn't fictional, and it didn't have a lot of magical elements, though it did have a lot of queer elements. And so I was constantly kind of like, I had to keep re-asking myself what I was trying to do with the project, like how are these things addressing the criteria that I'd sort of laid out for myself. And so like the story that I was attempting to do, I ended up not so much queering like or magicifying the content so much as I did the format. So what ended up happening was I started the story off as a very traditional, like once upon a time, this girl was a princess and her parents locked her up in a tower. And the whole premise is that she ends up not liking that so much. And historically what happens is that she leaves and decides to become a pirate. And her whole life is dedicated to leaving that life behind and in turn of this pirate life. And it's such a fun story. But originally the narrator was just going to tell it as like, oh, she got married and she had a nice time and that's it. And what I ended up doing was having our main character have a conversation with the author and be like, no, that's not what happened. This is what happened. And having this really direct conversation. So I had a lot of fun doing that. And at some point I was like, does this fit into is this a fairy tale? And then at the end I was like, you know what? It is. I think it is. So it was eventually included. But yeah, so like that playing with the formats and the rules and the content and all that was really fun. And that eventually as I progressed, I got more and more confident with what I knew would fit into it, and I started feeling more confident in like the decisions I could make for it, and the routes that I could take. So yeah, that's my 2 cents.
Wonderful. Brian Jansen kind of has a similar kind of follow-up question to that. So on this idea of manufactured authenticity, early fairy tales, like many forms within folk culture, whether blues, hip hop, even social movements, get co-opted. I mean, we see this time and time again with a lot of different mediums. Are there lessons in your project for resisting that co-optation? You have talked a little bit about finding ways to kind of make it your own and not necessarily rely on those usual tropes. I think this question could easily be for both of you as far as what is expected versus how you kind of wiggle your way in and try to create a new form or new expectations.
Yeah, I'll go first then. Yeah, I mean that I originally heard of the idea of manufactured authenticity actually through YouTube, and through conversations about how the YouTube format sort of creates this air of like the person who's uploading it is the sole person who is working on that. And a lot of the time we do see that, but there are also, you know, sections of YouTube that are run by corporations. And that's something that we see in social media in general. And so that, I mean, like, I didn't do a lot of research, I suppose, on the manufactured authenticity of it. And I don't have a lot of like literature to refer back to, I suppose, but like I definitely see fairy tales as a means of combating that. I think because fairy tales have always been sort of, at least I feel like they've seemed to me like such a genuine and wholesome and heartwarming kind of genre to look into. Even in stories that are meant for adults, you know, there's always this sort of aim to project some sort of social norm or some sort of morality. And a lot of times it's good. You know, we think about Disney doing that. But at the same time, you know, Disney has done a very good job at pretending that it's not a big corporation. And of course it is. And of course they're biased to things that are going to make them money rather than things that are, you know, good for the general public. You know, a lot of those times those intersect, but I don't know. I mean, like, I think there are lessons in just, you know, coming up with our own stories and writing our own stories. Like, I don't think that should be exclusive to people who've, you know, studied English for 4 years or whatever. Like, I think just that practice of telling stories, I think can be important for sort of co-opting our stories and creating our own narratives, I guess. Yeah, I don't know what Katherine has to say on the subject, but.
Yeah, I guess I tried really hard to avoid manufactured authenticity with this. I wanted it to feel, I mean, I'll be honest, I don't know much about the subject. I haven't studied it very often, but the work I was doing, I wanted it to feel like if I was going to tell someone these stories, this is how I would tell them. And I think I've kept that tone pretty well throughout my work. But yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have much on that topic.
No, it's okay. So I think this is maybe a good question for both of you, and I'm going to build off of a question that Melissa Leidenheim has asked here to you, Katherine, about whether you found any resolution through this in history, and I know a lot in creative writing. Reflective practice is a really important part, that you finish your research, you finish your writing, and after the fact, you kind of go back through it and say, what could I have done differently? What did I learn from this? And so how have each of you kind of at the end of this kind of found resolution within yourselves, within the stories that you tell?
I don't know if Katherine wanted to go first or not. That's okay. I mean, I think I don't know. I've definitely had some resolution in terms of my own writing process. I, especially like over the past year, have had to figure out how I was going to write everything and meet my goal by this date. And I think that like I had a very, you know, originally a very laissez-faire kind of approach to my writing. I always thought of it as like, you know, even though it was part of my education, it felt more like it was a hobby. And so I had a different approach to it that I had to eventually take. And I guess that might even relate to Holly's question about, you know, what it's been like as, you know, culminating for my time at UMaine, I guess, that like I've had to go from someone who's really personal and private about my writing to someone who could have a really thick skin when it came to writing workshops and like take criticism and hear that people don't like it, or and also like produce it in a way that can actually be can actually meet deadlines, I suppose. So I felt a lot of resolution in that, like my own writing process changed over the course of it, and I started to be a lot less judgmental about my own work, and more excited to experiment with it, I guess. Yeah, that's all I have to say for that.
I guess kind of similar to Nola in that effect. I didn't do creative writing before this. I did a little bit in high school, but I took one singular class on creative writing in my undergrad for 3 weeks over the winter break once. Definitely not nearly as much as Nola. So just the act of actually doing creative writing and doing it for something that was so important was a pretty big step for me. And then doing it about something that was so personal, focusing on my own family instead of literally anything else, and making myself kind of a central character in my work where I didn't really want to, but I did it anyways, was a really big step for me. And 4 years ago, I don't think I would have done that. And to be honest, when I started this work, I was planning to go to law school after college, and doing this thesis convinced me to go for a master's in English instead. So it's just kind of pushed me towards pursuing this more, I guess.
I see some celebratory icons here in the Zoom windows from English professors. So there's a question that Melissa made here that I think I'm going to expand on a little bit. So she had noted, Nola, that about your interesting comment on the magical elements as being spaces where queerness can really manifest itself. And you see this in other genres, Afrofuturism being a place where Black power can be seen as the normative. So do you think, in what ways do you think that this magical element kind of affords these spaces for these voices that are not normally heard? What is it about magic that makes this possible?
Yeah, so originally when I started this project, I met with Jennifer Moxley, who's a professor in the English department, and she used to be a part of the McGillicuddy Center, and I talked a little bit with her about what I might be interested in doing, and we talked a lot about allegories, because recently, at that point in her class prior, I had written an allegory that I was really proud of for like a poetry assignment or something. And I told her that I really liked that genre, that I liked that. And one of the things that she said that made me, like, I've just been thinking about since like a year and a half ago or so, was that allegories have this way of producing and sharing hidden knowledge or secret knowledge, in that they can be interpreted a lot of different ways. And you can sort of share this knowledge that might otherwise be really scary for someone to have, or be scary to talk about in difficult or unaccepting social settings. And the power of the allegory is that it can resonate with audiences sort of in like the eye of the beholder. Like someone can read a story and glean something entirely different from it than someone else. And that was something that like immediately set me off into the fairy tale genre. And like we talked about so many different, authors that had done really awesome work with allegories. And so that like that magical surreal element blending in with the allegorical element was like one of the things that I thought about the most writing this, because yeah, there are some stories that I've written that, specifically call out feminist issues or whatnot. And there are also some that, don't necessarily seem too related at all. And at the same time, like thinking about them through a feminist lens, we can see these issues, coming out of the woodwork. And that was something that just like immediately fascinated me about the whole subject. So I think that, like, just in short, that magical element helps sort of create that secret knowledge or that hidden knowledge, and share it in a clandestine sort of way, that feels like it's sort of mimicking that underground network that social movements often come out of. And yeah, so that was just like, I guess the main idea that I had throughout all of my work.
When Ivy had made a similar comment to your network, she had talked about the welcome home section of the piece. That to her, it raised the question of, do you think that women and members of the queer community need fairy tales to feel at home? Do you think we're moving to a place in which representation is, as much of the everyday that we don't think of it as needing a special place to fit in? Do you think we're there yet? Do you think that these kind of alternate spaces are still needed?
I think that, those alternate spaces, I think, I guess if we're thinking about like, countercultural spaces or like queer spaces or, different communities. I think it depends on the physical location, and like a lot of times different states or countries have various opinions on how people live their lives, and how people identify, and also how people have different skin tones, which is like crazy to some people. And we think about that, like, not necessarily. I guess I'm fortunate to think that, like, in Maine we have a pretty accepting, supportive environment, but at the same time there are also a lot of people who don't necessarily see it that way, or who don't necessarily support people of people of color or women or the LGBT community. And of course that number is dwindling, but I think that that it's not going to go away until it's completely gone. Like sort of the MLK quote, "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." That, like, it's probably always going to be an issue until the last homophobe is triumphed or whatever. And so I guess with how fairy tales might be able to, I guess how, whether or not they're needed. I am biased in that I think they're needed, and that I think they maybe need more attention, and they can be helpful, but I don't think that they're, the one and only solution to these problems. But I definitely think that they can be helpful, at least. I also think that, representation in media is such a huge thing that can be so helpful, and more helpful than I think people realize. And quality representation, not just ingenuine sort of attempts, but like I think that's just so important. And I think we've seen a lot of it, and I think there's been a lot more freedom. I think at least what I'm seeing, on TV or on Netflix or whatever, that people seem to be a lot more willing to put that, put people of color in the spotlight, put queer stories in the spotlight. But I guess we also have to think about that genuine factor, which maybe relates back to that, manufactured authenticity, and how authentic these representations are. Yeah, so I guess fairy tales could be seen as necessary, and maybe have a place that they could, afford. But yeah, I don't know. I think that's a great question, and something that we can all maybe think about. But yeah, I mean, in short, I think they're necessary, but who knows?
I'm curious, do each of you do you start your writing process with a particular audience in mind? Like Katherine, when you're writing about oral histories, is it initially for yourself? Is it for your family? Is it for other people to start thinking critically about the stories that are passed down in their families? Do you have an audience in mind? Do you think it changes with each piece?
That's a really good question. Typically, no. I think sometimes I use this writing almost as like a diary or just a way for me to work stuff out, but on paper. There are definitely like pieces within it where I directly address people, like family members that I'm trying to understand something about, and I'm working it out as I'm writing it down. But there's never really like larger outside audiences. It's almost a bit too personal in nature. It's just kind of what I'm thinking, just in a physical form now.
I think that's largely appealing to the public though. So don't discount writing something personal that is a topic that is so universal like this, even if it is particular stories to your family. Nola, is your intended audience people that are already on board? Is it people whose minds you would like to change? Could you see children reading some of these stories? Are these strictly adult stories? Where are you at thinking about audience?
Yeah, I guess like I never really think about the audience until I get into it, or until I get into the story. It's or I get into like the revision process, because sometimes adult content comes into the story, and I'm like, well, I guess I'll mark this as PG-13 or something. But yeah, I mean, I guess some of these stories are definitely definitely suitable for all ages, while some are like the Patchwork Woman relate a little bit more to older audiences, or are written for that purpose. But I think most of the poetry, I would say, is pretty suitable for all audiences. I tried to have a mix, but I know that like if someone were to pick up this collection in its whole, they might want to be an older audience, I think, just for some of the pieces. But yeah, I think for the most part, what I think about, I guess, when I'm writing these pieces is that I'm thinking a lot about the plot and like the overarching story first, and then I start thinking about how I'm going to write it and whose perspective I might tell it from. So I sort of have like a top down approach, and the audience is it kind of comes as I don't know, like secondary secondary thoughts I think about maybe a little bit later. I think because if I think about who I'm writing it towards, or if I'm writing it to a specific audience or specific person, then it tends to influence how the story comes out. So it kind of just ends up putting a lot of pressure on me to write it in a specific way. Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I know we're getting close to the end of time, and at the very end, I would like to have both of you talk for a moment about kind of the culmination of your fellowship, and how things have progressed. But I think I'd like to take advantage of having some family members in the house right now. Has this, for Katherine's family, for instance, for those of you willing to speak, has this changed at all how you see your own family history? Is this something you have always grappled with? What is truth? What is fiction? How have historic documents and conversations with families kind of changed how you think about your own family history?
So Katie's done an amazing job, and I'm so proud of her. And she's tiptoed the line and was concerned that some of the stories that she dug out might get us a little concerned and offended, which is absolutely the furthest thing from the truth. which I found a lot out of this process, because Katie and I lived it a lot of conversations back and forth, was it's great to learn about the past, and some of the past is better staying in the past, a lot of it being fables. But it's really opened up our eyes in a lot of my other side of the family. I met some people in Maine, relatives that I didn't even know existed. Katie has developed into an incredible, gifted woman out of this program for 4 years. Telling her I'm proud of her is an understatement. I think what she's delivered has been incredible. I'm looking forward to reading the whole project when it's over. She's matured into a writer and an adult that makes us very, very proud of her. I really can't tell you that I was underwhelmed with anything she dug out, even some of the stories that I thought was the truth. You know, it's good about the Irish, you forget everything but the grudge. And we learned a lot, and she spent a lot of time in Ireland and came back with even more stories. But I guess I went around a long way on giving you the answer to the question that she couldn't offend us. She did nothing but make us prouder, a stronger person. The 4 years that she's been up in the program has been an incredible, and the story isn't over. She's written a next process that'll go on in 2 years, and hopefully that'll be it, because the bill's getting heavy. But we're really excited about what she's doing. And I appreciate everything everyone's done there, and arm her with the tools that she's going to use for the rest of her life.
Wonderful. Well, I can't say equally as proud. I know there's no pride like a parent's pride, but we're quite proud of all of our fellows. Celeste, I'd love to get your opinion as well. I mean, you work a lot with a variety of writers, and particularly being the mother of a daughter who's writing about strong women and feminist values. I would love to hear your opinion of Nola's work.
I'm her mom, you know, I'm really proud of what she's been doing, and I'm proud of the voice that she has. You know, that's kind of, I guess when I was raised, we had princesses and all that, you know, and I see how marketing directs parents to raise their children, you know, in certain, I don't know, in certain ways. And I'm really proud that she has a voice of her own, and she looks at things in ways that I could never, or that I wouldn't, you know, just, she's pretty amazing and pretty talented. And, you know, I'm not here to be the administrative person for the English department. I'm here as Nola's mom tonight. And
Wonderful. Well, I think this would be the perfect way to wrap it up, would be to just get both of you to talk a little bit about your experience as a fellow, or your greater experience within your programs at UMaine as you are getting ready to go on off into the world, so to speak. Either one can start.
Yeah, I can go ahead, I guess. I have a lot of programs to speak about. I'm in English, honors, political science, and the McGillicuddy Center, but all in all, it's been pretty amazing. I didn't come into the school with a major, and then I went to political science, and now I'm in English 3 years now, and I'm loving it. And it's been really great being able to look at English again in a different light. I loved it in high school, but I didn't think I could ever make a career out of it. And I'm really glad that literally everyone told me that it was wrong once I started taking English classes again, and that yes, I could make a career out of my English degree, no matter what it was. And also it didn't matter if I could make a career out of my English degree, it just mattered if I was proud of it. And with the Honors College, I stumbled for a bit there, but they held me up and pushed me towards the finish line. And I don't know if I can ever say how grateful I am for that. And I guess it kind of all culminated with the McGillicuddy Center. Getting this fellowship was kind of the confirmation that 3 years paid off so far. I ended up applying for this last minute after I was evacuated from my study abroad experience. I still don't know how I pulled together an application that fast and how I got funding for it, but it was kind of exactly what I needed. And I'm so excited to use these tools as I move towards my graduate program in the fall. And yeah, I guess thank you. Thank you.
We're always happy to support research, and per your comment of, I don't know how I got funded. We love funding projects that people care about, that are personal, even if it's not personal in the way that your research is personal, Katherine. We like to see that fellows are truly engaged with what they're doing research in, that they're not just kind of regurgitating information that other big names have said, but they're really finding a way to make it their own. And so that's the reason that all of our fellows are chosen, is that we saw your passion and we saw your connection to the research. So thank you. Nola, any big takeaways after your 4 years here?
Yeah, I definitely feel like, I guess, in general, as a college student, I've changed a lot. I've been a part of so many different things, especially this past semester. I kept on saying yes to things, and they all, benefited me greatly. But I was part of Story, the creative writing group, from my very first year. That was something that I was absolutely in love with and wanted to be a part of. And I learned so much from that experience. And then, I took that experience to creative writing workshops and, in different classes that I was in. And I grew even more from that. And then this year I was part of the Open Field, the literary magazine, and had a whole bunch of other, experiences with that. And then with this fellowship last year, I knew that I wanted to put together some sort of project, but didn't really know what. And I had heard about it the semester or two before that, and was like, oh man, that'd be really cool. But I don't know what I have to do with that. And I also was like, am I going to even have the time? I don't know. And sometimes I didn't have the time, I'll be honest, but it was so worth it. One of the things that I wrote about in the sort of introductory piece that I mentioned, that helped me, work on this whole project, was that I mentioned that as a kid, when I was really young, I really loved Disney princesses. So much, in fact, that my mother told me that at some point I wore a Cinderella dress for 3 weeks straight, I think, and I didn't want to take it off even if I slept. So Disney movies have been pretty influential in my life, and that fascination and personal connection with the fairy tale genre just kind of propelled me through this whole this whole project. And every time I looked into a scholar or whatever who had written about something or other, I was like, I didn't even know people were talking about this. This is just so cool. And I learned so much about this, and I learned I could talk forever about fairy tales now. And it just kind of started with that really personal connection about the, just always wearing a Cinderella dress or whatever. I'm going every Halloween as a different Disney princess or whatever. I don't know, just that personal connection with these, these fairy tales that have grown and been reshaped throughout the years, and have culminated into these stories that we all know and love. And I loved dissecting them and thinking about them in this creative writing process, as something that I could maybe create as my own thing at some point. And I did. And it was just all of it was just so wonderful and exciting. And I was so glad to be able to spend all this time working on it and reading about these things and, doing all of this work. And just, I don't know, thinking about it in such a new and different way. I really I enjoyed the whole process. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, for those of you that enjoyed this tonight, I do want to remind you that we have another night of the showcase tomorrow night, 7 to 8:30 again. You can use the same link for tomorrow. And two of our other fellows, Nolan Altvader, who will be speaking on Wabanaki Tools of Diplomacy. He's a member of the Passamaquoddy tribal nation and is a future tribal educator. And so he's looking into ways of better implementing the LD 291 Wabanaki Studies law. And with him tomorrow night is going to be Haley Sedor, who's looking at the Holocaust in Lithuania and public memory of those events. So I do hope that you can join us tomorrow night for that. If you are a student on this call interested in being a fellow, maybe this sparked something within yourself of some research that you would like to do, or maybe you know a student who might be interested, please do have them reach out to me at mhc@maine.edu, or there's information on our website about the fellowship program if you're interested in applying. But I want to wish congratulations to Katherine and Nola, not just on your great work at the center and at UMaine these past 4 years, but for all the great things that we are pretty confident that you are going to go out into the world and do. So you are wonderful human beings to represent the Humanities Center while you're here, and just congratulations and well done.
Thank you.